Hello. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you for the organiser for inviting me and for all the hard work that was put into making this conference. It is the most glamorous conference that I've ever been to. I feel like a superstar. It's also really wonderful to be here at such an exciting time for your city and for the museum as well. There's lots of changes happening. Today I'd like to talk to you about that project, The Past is Now, Birmingham and British Empire. Which was now a couple of years ago, but it was a project that changed my life, basically, where I was invited alongside a team of co-curators, all of whom were women of colour, to curate an exhibition which confronts Birmingham and Britain's history of empire using the museum's existing collections as well as contemporary art. But first, I would like to acknowledge the recent tragic events that happened here in Germany. I want us to reflect on how our politicians and the media continue to divide us and how we let them divide us. I want us to think about how colonialism continues today through corrupt corporations in former colonies and through the way we treat black people, people of colour and Muslims in Europe. I would appreciate if we can have a minute's silence in memory of those we have lost, starting now. Thank you. Can museums be a site of hope? It's a complicated question. Whose hopes do we mean? Is it the hopes of museum staff? Is it the hopes of the community museums are meant to serve and those who they actually serve? Is it the hopes of newly arrived refugees? Is it the hope of a nation that refuses to recognise non-white people as people? Is it the hopes of companies like BP, the oil company, that sponsor museum exhibitions in the UK, sometimes? What happens when different versions of the future and what we hope for it collide? Each of us have our own vision for what a museum will look like, and each of us will have our own vision for what we want society to look like. What we hope for our museums is often another way of asking what we want for our communities. So to me, hope lies in confronting the past, especially the things we'd rather not talk about, in order to change our present. This is one definition of decolonizing, the idea and process of confronting colonialism or colonial histories honestly so we can change our society today. It is only recently that empire and colonialism has begun to be spoken about in the mainstream. Our children learn a whitewashed version of history. Britain maintains a delusion of self-sufficiency and unique greatness, by rarely, if ever, acknowledging the brutalities of the transatlantic slave trade, the barbarities unleashed because of partition, and the policies that led to genocides such as that of the Bengal famine in 1943, where 3 million people died. Like all cities, Birmingham is divided, and these divisions stem in all kinds of ways from colonial rule. Birmingham was the factory of empire, the site of the Industrial Revolution, which was funded by the work of enslaved people on the sugar plantations of the Caribbean. Birmingham produced Britain's metalwork, which means it produced its guns. It gave the world the word eugenics. And its most celebrated figure is Joseph Chamberlain, who was the colonial secretary and a committed racist imperialist who was involved in sort of creating apartheid in South Africa. Today, nearly 50% of Birmingham's population are not white, and it is not a coincidence that Birmingham has a very significant far-right and white nationalist presence. For me, in Birmingham's history and its present, there is an opportunity to transform the role of the museum within public life. Instead of upholding hegemonic narratives of national identity, the museum could have a role in transforming it. As an exhibition, the past has now centered these narratives, taking an anti-capitalist and decolonial perspective. So as I mentioned, all the co-curators were women of colour, and it was also headed by Sarah Wedgett, who is a woman of colour as well, though obviously class and stuff is quite complicated. And most of the museum staff were white. We started out kind of full of hope and had particular expectations, but at the same time there was this anxiety about, because when you're a non-white person entering an institutional space, you automatically feel like there's going to be issues, you just feel it. So there's two stages to the curation process. One was decolonizing the collection, so looking at objects from colonial histories and sort of contextualizing them, writing the interpretation, etc. The other kind of part of the curation process is the idea of decolonizing the museum itself. So thinking about the emotional labor and experiencing the resistance, and thinking about institutional change in terms of whiteness as well. So I want to focus on the second part, this idea of what relationships were built and broken during this project. And if there are any questions about the specifics of the project, you can ask me afterwards. So the co-curation comprised of several meetings. We were shown the permanent collections and asked to critique the neutral museum tone. We toured the museum storage spaces, and we were given talks about how the museum's collections historically categorized peoples and nations. And we were asked to reflect upon traumatic histories from which we all had benefited from to varying degrees. Without fully realizing it, the curators were providing a map of how the museum institutionalized a nation's forgetfulness, a history in which the colonized is dehumanized, where stolen objects are neatly accounted for, providing interesting and educational ways into history for the majority white audience. Very quickly, it became clear that the museum and ourselves went into this project with very different expectations. To me, contextualizing an object or narrating history from the perspective of the colonized is the surface level of decolonizing, and the deeper work is considering how museums are complicit until this day. Museums are resistant to change because to truly interrogate their existence would require awkward conversations about their continued preservation and protection of whiteness. Why was the curation of this project so difficult? Well, that's because museums contain stolen objects, but they also have stolen how we look at each other. Museums operate within a complex system of myth-making, one with its roots in celebrating and justifying colonial endeavour, most notoriously through human zoos, which dehumanize black and brown people, but also, as mentioned previously, in cataloguing structures, curatorial and collecting practices, which still continue till this day. So museum staff were aware of what decolonizing meant in relation to collections, but they weren't prepared for us, basically. We wanted to draw attention to the museum as an imperial structure that is intimately tied to systemic whiteness. We also wanted to highlight how individuals reproduce institutions. And I think that's a really important point, that when we come into the room, we often like to think of ourselves as individuals, but that is not really, it's much more complicated than that. In meetings, we threw out phrases like white fragility and systemic racism to staff who had never been confronted in this way. Museums usually expect gratitude and like to think of themselves as benevolent when it comes to what they describe as source communities, right? They don't want dissent, so it's quite confronting. And so whilst we were allowed creative freedom within the exhibition, it often felt like the price of our honesty was to jeopardize future projects and also the relationships with the curators. We were never really sure where we stood. Of course, we understood what was happening because our lived experiences with racism and a certain amount of empathy meant we understood that it was basically, when you're letting go of privilege, that's a painful thing. And we were asking the curators not only to question their professional practices, but to be involved in a conversation about them as people in Birmingham who lived with us, usually probably in areas that weren't our areas, for instance. There were several flashpoints to do with the design components and certain key decisions that were made without us. But the thing is, this exhibition is still being spoken about today, and it was a huge success. But what does that mean? Because whose labor was it based upon? We were paid very little for what we did. And I know it sounds like a small thing, but it's not when you need to pay the bills. It was a challenging experience. And we had to set aside questions like, am I being exploited? And would a white man accept this? And what about self-care so we could decolonize, right? And we spent hours arguing about things like the interpretation and like really thinking about it and really bringing our expertise, not only as people that have lived experiences, but as professionals, right? I'm a writer, other people were curators, designers. This is part of our profession as well, but we were never sort of treated in that way. Yeah, so hope. Hope is a shared project. When we want something to happen, we look to our public spaces to make our dreams come true, but also to expand our dreams through collaboration, cooperation, the exchange of ideas. These public spaces are built on the labour of black and brown folk and continue to exploit while simultaneously demanding gratitude for our exploitation. When institutions proclaim a commitment to diversity, inclusion, or decoloniality, we need to attend to these claims with a critical eye. I've said this many times, but the desire to collect decoloniality comes from the same place as when you want to display black people and black and brown people as part of empire's collection. Decolonizing can be a way of talking about colonialism as a distant history, but the thing is, colonialism is here right now within us all. There are no lone wolves, only systems that rescue some people and leave others defenseless. We are connected in ways far deeper than any of us can imagine. Our public institutions can replicate the ways our governments operate, or they can choose a different path. Hope lies in how we can speak about the unspeakable. Our museums can be the places to facilitate transformation and healing, but only once they've had these conversations about themselves. Okay, thank you.